So I want to talk about colour fidelity and colour management in digital systems. I'm going to assume you have some familiarity with the CIE system, which allows colours to be specified by three numbers, X, Y and Z, and that if we consider the proportional amounts of X and Y, known as little x and little y, or chromaticity coordinates, and plot one against the other, we get what is hopefully a familiar horseshoe-shaped locus of colour, and this shows all the colours in the natural world. The more saturated ones towards the periphery, the less saturated ones towards the centre. Of course, colour space is three-dimensional, so this is a two-dimensional projection from a three-dimensional space. So you can imagine a third axis coming out of this diagram towards you, let's say brightness. So for example, at the centre of this diagram, you have the whites, blacks and greys all existing at the same point. So always bear in mind that colour space is really three-dimensional. Now, I'm sure all of you have a tablet or a smartphone, and on these devices colour is defined at each point or pixel on the screen by RGB values, where RGB stands for red, green and blue. And these are the amounts of three primaries that make up the colour of the screen. You'll have probably used some sort of colour picker GUI like this. You can see in the bottom right hand of that GUI the red, green and blue values from 0 to 255. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of colour theory about why it is that a very large range of colours can be produced from mixing just three primaries. But I will say that the reason why red, green and blue are the additive primaries has nothing to do with any ideology, but is simply because those three primaries happen to give the biggest colour gamut or biggest colour space. So it's a pragmatic or practical choice. Now, the reason why I introduced CIE is because if we take the RGB values of a primary display system, we measure the CIE chromaticity coordinates and plot them, then we get this. So the corners or the vertices of this triangle shows you the pure red, pure green and pure blue on an RGB display, and within the triangle we have all of the colours that can be displayed on this device. And as you can see, this typical RGB device can only display about half of all the colours that are actually possible in the world. Of course, because you're looking at this presentation on a display, we really should show the chromaticity diagram like this, because obviously colours outside the triangle of your display device can't be seen on your device. But we tend to show it as it is on the left hand side, as a representation, not as a faithful rendition of what the colours actually look like. Now, things start to get complicated when you realise that there is not one single RGB standard or space. Life would be a lot simpler if that was the case. It's not. In the 1950s, the National Television System Committee in the US specified a set of phosphors, as we used in CRTs at the time, to produce a set of primaries, and they were replaced in 1969 by a less saturated but brighter set. Meanwhile, the European Broadcasting Union was specifying its own set of phosphors used in Europe, Canada and Japan, known as Recommendation 601. And then in 1990, a new set of primaries was agreed for high definition TV, known as Recommendation 709. And this table shows the CIE chromaticity coordinates of the four different primary systems I just mentioned. And you can see they're all different. This shows how different. So this shows the triangular gamuts of the original NSTC primaries and the later SMPTE primaries. So what this means is that if you take a pure green, RGB 02550, it will be a very different colour on a display that's based on SNTC primaries than it would be for a display based on SMPTE primaries. And this next slide shows the difference between recommendation 601, that is European TV, and SMPTE, that is US TV. Small, but actually very important and significant differences. And of course, these are standards, but if you take any particular display, it might be based on a standard, but if you actually measured the RGB primaries, they might differ. And in 2004, I published a book, and we talked about a particular display we had in the lab in that book, which was nominally based on recommendation 601. And here you can see the difference between the actual standard and our actual display. So all this means that if we didn't have colour management, then because different colour imaging devices use different technology, and even within, for example, the RGB technology, you've got all sorts of different technologies such as CRT, LCD, organic LED, and then different standards. Because of this, if we displayed the same RGB values or the same image file on 4 different displays, as in this case, we'd probably get 4 completely different coloured scenes. I like to give the example that if 9 people took the same picture at a football match with different cameras and brought them back and displayed all 9 on the same computer screen, without colour management we'd get this, or worse. And this is because different cameras have also different spectral sensitivities, so different cameras have essentially different RGB colour spaces. If we then take one of these images, for example the one in the centre, and display that image on 9 different displays, then again we could get this sort of variability because of the reasons I've been discussing. And then to make it worse, there are settings on displays such as contrast and brightness and colour temperature. So the user can change the contrast, and if they do that, you can see the effect on colour on screen in this simulation I've got here. So the same RGB values producing very, very different colours, and ditto for the change of brightness. And also colour temperature, so the user can change the white point of the monitor, which essentially makes the white warmer or cooler, and it has a massive effect on the colour rendition of the scene. So it should be clear to you now that a lack of colour fidelity comes from the fact that different image capture devices, cameras, scanners, etc., have different spectral sensitivities and capture different RGB values. Different image display devices use different technologies and then display the same RGB values as different colours. And printers, well, they don't even use RGB technology in the main, they use CMYK technology, which also varies from one printer manufacturer to another and introduces a whole new set of problems. So colour management is the process of ensuring that the colours of images and documents is consistent when using different computers, displays and printers. And the approach taken to colour management in Microsoft and Apple systems alike is one of adjusting the RGB values before you display or print them to compensate for differences between devices. And this is possible in the modern world because of the International Colour Consortium, the ICC, which deserves a huge amount of credit for the success of colour imaging today. Originally, Adobe, Agfa, Apple, Kodak, Microsoft, Silicon Graphics, Sun and Taligent in 1993 formed this consortium to create a universal colour management system that would function transparently across all operating systems and software packages, essentially enabling lots of different displays and cameras and printers to talk to each other, or at least to talk to the operating system in the same language. So the idea would be that if you have a camera and you take an image, then there would be a device profile for that camera which would describe the RGB values of your particular camera in terms of a profile connection space in the center of this diagram. You'll recognize the CIE diagram. And then when you display it, for example, on the bottom left on a display device, there'd be a device profile for that particular display which would compensate the RGB values before they're sent to the display to account for the fact that that display has its own particular RGB set of primaries. And the interesting thing is all of this is happening all the time. It's ubiquitous, but it's also invisible. When you install a device, you install a driver normally. That driver contains a default profile which describes that generic device or that manufacturer's device. One other thing worth mentioning is working color space. If you're dealing in Photoshop, for example, then the working color space can be different from the profile connection space, or even different from the display space. So for example, you go to a color picker in Adobe Photoshop and you pick RGB values in your working space. They are then converted to the profile connection space and then converted into your display space using your display profile. Entry-level color management is ubiquitous but invisible. Whenever you watch your phone, tablet, computer screen, print out, take a photo, watch cinema, or watch a lecture, color management is working behind the scenes to make the colors look right. And it's inherently built into Microsoft and Apple operating systems. So that in theory, if you look at 4 different screens like this with the same scene, you should see the same thing. But in fact, you don't. Anyone who's used color will know that you don't see the same thing. And the reason for that is your device profiles are default profiles. On your particular display, for example, you may change the brightness or the contrast settings or the color temperature, or your device may vary from a typical device produced by that manufacturer. And essentially, that sort of variability isn't taken into account by this ubiquitous but invisible entry-level color management. So most devices come with a profile which allows the color management system to make the necessary adjustments. The color management system is part of the Apple and Microsoft operating systems. Some software such as Photoshop overrides or adds on to this, adds additional functionality. Some image file formats contain profile information. So for example, if you take an image with a camera and save it as a TIFF, in the header of the TIFF is stored some information about the camera RGB color space. This allows the color management software on the operating system to deal with the image accordingly. But if an image doesn't include any color management information, if the source is unknown, then the image is assumed to be sRGB. So sRGB is another RGB color space. And so it turns out that sRGB is a good RGB space for the internet. If you're saving images for the internet, save them in sRGB space, because most of the stuff on the internet isn't color managed. So we've added here on the diagram, on the table, the chromaticity coordinates of sRGB space. So in 1996, HP, Hewlett-Packard and Microsoft proposed this RGB space as a device-independent standard. It's compatible with recommendation 709. So the idea was, if all images were encoded as sRGB, then they could be displayed directly on most displays without any additional color management. It's a nice idea, but the problem was some professionals rejected it because the sRGB space has a small colour gamut compared to some other colour spaces. So it hasn't replaced CIE XYZ space, which is still the heart of the ICC, but it is widely used, as I said, for images that have no colour management information. So entry-level colour management works okay. Reds appear red, blues appear blue, but sometimes and often in design that isn't good enough. And hopefully you can now understand that whilst it's impressive that colour fidelity is as good today as it is, it's also not surprising that it's not perfect, since the default profiles for each device cannot hope to take into account individual device variability and individual device settings. The question is, does it matter? Well, after a hard day at work, I like to come home and watch Peppa Pig on YouTube. When I do that, because I'm watching it on the internet, because my display is not colour managed other than the standard entry-level colour management, then sometimes the colour of the pigs varies from one evening to the next and one show to the next. Is this a problem? Not at all, because this is an example where entry-level colour management is absolutely fine. But what about cases where it's not absolutely fine? The classic one is internet shopping. So my understanding is if people buy things online, they send them back. The biggest single reason why people send things back that they bought off the internet is that the colour's wrong. The colour isn't what they expected it was going to be based on what they saw on the screen. Now, although you can argue that most people will, most retailers will allow you to send things back free of charge. There's a cost somewhere along the line. You're not being charged directly for sending it back, but it's making the process more expensive, and that makes internet retailing less financially viable than it should be. Obviously not for, say, books. If you buy a book on Amazon, you probably don't care about the colour of the cover, for example. But if you're buying, for example, clothes, colour probably matters a great deal. And a second example of where colour really matters is with, say, medical imaging. So imagine a doctor carrying out an operation in London, but being advised by a world expert consultant in Beijing. And the consultant in Beijing is taking part in the operation remotely through live video feed, and would probably want to see exactly the right colour on screen, because very small differences in colour of tissue or blood, for example, could have certainly make the consultant think differently clinically. So medical imaging, often the colour is absolutely critical. So I define 3 levels of colour management. We've got this entry-level colour management, which is provided by ICC and sRGB. We're using it all the time without realising it. It's been a tremendous success. Then we have professional colour management. This can provide a higher level of colour fidelity, but it normally requires special equipment to create custom profiles. So you can see in this diagram a display with a device hanging on top of it, which is measuring colours on the display. This allows the software which comes with the profiling device to create a custom profile that takes into account the particular properties and settings of your actual display device. And finally, I won't be talking about this anymore in this presentation, there's research level colour management. If you really want top colour fidelity, then there are things you can do, which we do in the laboratory, which don't use ICC at all, and are far too complicated for me to go into in this lecture. So professional colour management, you'd buy something like a spider or a colour monkey, and you'd use it to build a profile for your display monitor, the same devices can, here you've got, you can see some of the software being used, and you can see different profiles can be associated with this device. You can pick a particular profile, one that you've made, for example, rather than one which was provided as a default for your device. And the same profiling devices can be used to produce a profile for a printer. So you print out a range of colors on your printer of known RGB or CMYK values, and then you run the device down the colors as in this example, and the device measures the CIE values of the printed colors and then produces a profile for your printer that, for example, takes into account the particular inks you're using, the particular paper you're using, or even the particular settings you're using on your printer. So one reason why even professional level colour management is never going to be perfect is the problem of gamut. So this shows the triangular gamut of a typical RGB display device, and we can also see the blue line polygon, which shows the stylized gamut of a CMYK printer. So what you can see is that there are colours, for example bright reds and bright greens, which you can have on your display, which physically cannot be produced by your printer. They're outside the printer gamut. And yet there are also colours, for example bright yellows, that can appear on your printer that cannot be displayed on your display because they're outside of your display's colour gamut. This is a serious issue. There are ways of dealing with it, mitigating with it to some extent, and if you look in, for example, the colour management settings of Photoshop, you'll see something about rendering intents. And I'm not going into the detail here, but these rendering intents basically instruct the colour management software what to do when you essentially have a mismatch in gamuts between, let's say, a display device and a hard copy printout device. So I hope you found that useful. For further reading, if you want to know more about the CIE system then, and also different technologies for colour display, colour printing, then Burns's book, Bielmar and Saltzman's Principles of Colour Technology would be a fantastic place to start. There's lots of books about how to use real-world colour management, usually in Photoshop, such as this 2003 one. If you're a masochist and you really want to start learning about research level colour management, then my book on computational colour science, there's a 2012 second edition now, I just realised, would be a good place to start. And if you want a lighter read about any of this, then my blog, colourware.org, is a good place to go to.